Many centuries ago, man in this part of Africa went into partnership with termites to process copper. The Balunda, the Baluba, the Basanga of ancient Zaire used the clay produced by termites to help smelt copper and produce implements of agriculture, weapons of war, sometimes decorations, and money for exchange. A long, long time ago, a strange partnership. And then the Europeans came. Did they want to learn from the technology they found here? Oh no. At least the Baluba and the Balunda had consulted the technology of the termites and benefited from it. But European technology was more arrogant, more self-confident, less compromising. It abolished the old technological order, and in its wake, it left new forms of desolation in Africa. Yes, the West arrived in Africa with a bang. The soil recoiled in a whimper. Britain's colonial policymaker, Lord Lugard, argued that Europe had a double mission in Africa. One was to develop Africa's resources for Africa's own benefit. The other was to use those resources to meet the growing industrial requirements of the Western world. Lugard called these two goals the dual mandate. Our story is about this dual mandate, this intended partnership between Africa and the West, and how far it's been fulfilled. Europe's new technology has descended upon Africa in search of the continent's virgin wealth. The African landscape will never be the same again. And so, they dig up Africa faster than they have ever done before. And yet, it's one of the cruel ironies of the world economy that a continent so rich in natural resources should at the same time be so poor in living standards. The factories, the furnaces of the world are clamoring for African manganese, African copper, chromium, platinum, you name it. Africa produces it. The romantics among us would prefer to think of Africa as God's treasure chest of diamonds. After all, we produce more diamonds than anybody else. We like to think of Africa as a golden continent. We produce more gold than anybody else. And yet, this same rich continent, this vast treasure island, is inhabited by poverty-stricken inhabitants. Why? Something has gone wrong, tragically wrong, in the partnership between Western technology and African resources. And yet, the digging continues. Dig, dig, dig. Is it for wealth, or is it for the collective burial of a people? Some would argue that the West had brought development to Africa. Perhaps by the dual mandate, Lord Lugard meant an exchange of African resources for Western technology. A new civilization on wheels is now vibrating along African streets from Dar es Salaam to Dakar. In all my travels in 5 different continents, I still continue to be astonished by the great variety of African skylines. Every African city is a miracle of transition. The mixture is between the foreign and the indigenous, the old and the new, the natural and the artificial. But much of it is a mirage. Half of it is a facade. In Africa, the glittering goods are more a symbol of imported consumption than of genuine local prosperity. We in Africa are buying goods from other nations rather than making them ourselves. The West has given Africa only the shimmering illusion of technological know-how in exchange for the solid substance of Africa's resources. In what continent am I? Africa or Europe? If I'm confused, it's because it's all a facade of a Western-style skyline behind which lies a very different story. Westernization without real modernization. Appearances reminiscent of the West, behind which lie the realities of Africa. The facilities at this expensive hotel in West Africa are a simple illustration of the problem. What have we got to show here in Africa for 300 years of contact with Western technology? Well, of course, we have acquired Western consumption patterns, Western appetites. We like our television set when we can afford it. We like our radio, our air conditioner, a bathroom in the Western style, perhaps a fan. In other words, we have acquired Western tastes, but have we got the Western skills to make them work? As they say in these parts, the radio is quenched. The television, well and truly quenched. As for the Western-style bathroom with hot and cold running water, well, there's cold water, all right. And there is a hot water tap. But it's worse than quenched. It's never been connected. There's no hot water pipe at all. There is a very courteous hotel notice here encouraging me to report to the management if there's anything wrong in the room. You've got it. Quenched. More sad than the death of kings is the death of ancient skills surrounding them. Once upon a time, African kings and chiefs were patrons to great artists and craftsmen. Civilizations in gold and bronze were maturing. Techniques had been evolving since the 12th century. The most famous African sculpture is from Ife and Benin in West Africa. Some outsiders scoffed, claiming that the bronzes came from the lost continent of Atlantis. By the time the Portuguese arrived, the art had become so realistic that it portrayed the visitors in remarkable detail. But the Portuguese and other Europeans hadn't come to admire African skill. Their eyes were on a new and fearsome trade, not in African products, but in the very African producers themselves. slavery was not simply a denial of freedom for those Africans actually captured, it was also a denial of development for the continent they left behind. Europe not only refused to help develop Africa, it savagely disrupted skills already in the making. The most symbolic Western institution in Africa at the time was the fortress, an impregnable trading factory. The factory's merchandise, human beings. Elmina Castle in Ghana was once a silent witness to those dreadful obscenities. It was in cells like these that the captives waited for the slave ships that were going to take them abroad. Sometimes they were packed close together, sweating on each other, sometimes lying in their own urine, their own filth, for days or weeks on end. If cholera broke out, a whole cell could be wiped out or more. Well, we had our slavery too. Domestic slavery was not unknown in Africa. But this scale of callousness was quite alien to us. As an African visiting a place like this, seeing all this, I begin to have some kind of idea as to what the Jew might feel if he visits Auschwitz or some other Nazi German concentration camp and sense those powerful emotions of bewilderment, of anger, of infinite sadness. The slave trade rapidly transformed Africans into the most humiliated race in human history. Within 2 centuries alone, over 12 million Africans were exported to the New World, the Americas. It's estimated that for every slave who reached the American market, another died in transit. Those who survived proved to be more durable than either Indians or poor whites. Ironically, the African slave trade persisted partly because African slaves were so tough. Cotton and textiles became part of a triangular relationship between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Africans were dragged across the Atlantic to grow cotton. The cotton was shipped to European factories. The manufactured textiles were then exported to Africa to buy slaves. This evil triangle helped the growth of the industrial might of the West, but probably aborted West Africa's own industrial takeoff. Africa had exported to the West men and women, potential implements of production. Africa had imported from the West guns, by definition, instruments of destruction. Indeed, the slave trade and the gun trade were interlocked. In some cases, guns were the currency with which slaves were bought. Slaves in exchange for guns. Africa had helped to enhance the industrial revolution of the West through those very slaves sent by force there. And yet the guns out here initiate a whole new culture of violence. That culture of violence extends right into present-day Africa. Jerry Rawlings, Ghana's 5th military ruler since independence, gives his office staff rifle practice. 3 of his own predecessors were killed. There have been well over 70 coups in independent Africa. The new rulers of Liberia in 1980 celebrated their coup by executing previous rulers. Carnage by the sea. The West's technology of destruction still decimates Africa. In the West, technology initiated other changes which in turn affected Africa. As the Industrial Revolution became more mature, slavery became less efficient than wage labor. Mature capitalism was making slavery out of date. It was ironic in a way. Normally, as the Bible reminds us, it's harder for the rich to be virtuous than for the poor, at least at the level of individual behavior. And yet, here were Britain and northern United States becoming more humane as societies precisely as they became more prosperous. High technology was making high morality possible. And so it looked as if the rich could afford to be compassionate at long last. Britain, the largest shipping nation in the slave trade in the 18th century, became the leading abolitionist power in the 19th. Equipped with this new moral fervor, Westerners cast their eyes afresh at Africa. Eastern Africa was among the areas which whetted the new territorial appetites. But there was already an imperial presence here, the Arabs. They had arrived in different roles, merchants or conquerors, explorers and builders of sultanates. Some were just traders who came by dhow and went back to Arabia with the annual monsoon winds. Others settled along the East African coast, intermarried with Africans, and created new communities and city-states. A whole new civilization emerged, partly Arab and partly African, with a new African language, Kiswahili, a distinctive way of life, a distinctive architecture, cuisine, music, customs and traditions. But the civilization had one major flaw, slavery. The local technology had not yet outgrown the slavery system as it had in the West. But the nature of the slave system which the Arabs practiced was different. Arab slavery mixed the races. Anglo-Saxon slavery separated them. My own extended family is mixed. We are descended both from masters and slaves, from rulers and subjects. If the father was a Mazrui, the child was a Mazrui, regardless of whether the mother was once a slave. Indeed, under Islamic law, the mother became free as a result of bearing her master a child, and children were fundamentally free if their father was free. Now contrast this with Anglo-Saxon forms of slave ownership. In the United States, fathers actually sold their children if the mothers were slaves. Remember Chicken George in Alex Haley's Roots? Haley's grandfather was sold by his own father into slavery, a position quite inconceivable under Islamic law. Of course, Arab slavery was evil, but Western slavery was often worse, and the Arabs have certainly suffered from Western perspectives of history. Zanzibar's slave caves suited Western propaganda well. After all, the missionaries could raise more money by proclaiming a crusade against the Arabs. The empire builders could get moral justification for their activities. And so the cartoonists, the sketch makers started work, portraying the villainy of the Arabs in Eastern Africa. It was a new law of Western cynicism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Have you ever stopped to wonder what happened to the slaves that the Arabs are supposed to have sold? Where are they, all those slaves? Well, when you think about it, there is a kind of disappearing act that took place. Approximately 100 million people of African derivation are today in the Western world, probably quite a few millions more. Contrast this with the numbers in the Arabian Peninsula. There are only 2 million people with African blood in the Arabian Peninsula. And that trade to Arabia was supposed to have started at least 1,000 years earlier than the transatlantic slave trade. Where are those slaves? European cartoonists were not interested in such niceties. They were promoting a colonizing crusade. Africa had to be saved from the Arabs and secured for the West. At the Berlin Conference in 1885, 14 Western powers assembled to discuss the partition of Africa. Not a single African was present. The Arab slave trade was one of the pretexts for intervention. The scramble for Africa was underway. King Leopold of the Belgians was bidding for the Congo as his own personal real estate, rich in rubber. He got it, a vast private property larger than the original 13 British colonies of America. A new form of terror was about to succeed the slave trade. A structure which has served both as a fortress and as a prison cannot but symbolize oppression. Mind you, by the standards of justice of Leopold II, imprisonment was a positive kindness. He had harsher methods of sanctions. Whole villages burnt down because of the offense of a single individual. Limbs mutilated. Even children sometimes killed because of the offenses of the parents. You know, when the white man first arrived in this part of Africa, it wasn't the natives that needed to be civilized. It was the white man. The West had condemned the Arab slave trade, but followed it with their own barbarism. Workers who didn't produce enough were sometimes mutilated as an example to others. The train was an important instrument of conquest entering Africa, and Europeans were motivated by three compelling forces: gold, God, and glory. Gold for the Europeans themselves, God for the natives, and the greater glory of Europe. But they had one additional piece of luggage whenever they penetrated Africa. The luggage was, quite simply, racism. It was with them all the time. It's with us in this very compartment. There's a sign saying dogs and natives are not to be admitted. The sign is in both French and Flemish. I'm sure it was rigidly enforced. Europeans claimed that railways brought development, but the train was also an instrument of extraction, taking African wealth out of the continent. Among the extreme extractors of the Victorian era and the most successful diamond magnate of his time was Cecil Rhodes. As South Africa's first millionaire, he used wealth to get power. He carved out a vast dominion of his own. Two countries were named after him, Northern and Southern Rhodesia. Rhodes' pioneers set out in 1890 in search of new worlds to conquer on the Tropic of Capricorn, in the teeth of African resistance. Thousands of African lives and hundreds of white lives were lost. The conquerors called it Pax Britannica, the pacification of Africa under the British flag. Poor England, what obscenities have been committed in your name? Rhodes created one of the first armies of white mercenaries in Africa. They conquered, so they claimed, for queen and country. Alas, it was once again for greed and grandeur. Pax Britannica indeed. Cecil Rhodes' worldview included one article of faith, a belief that Africa was one. Even faraway, desolate places were to him elements of the wholeness of this continent. In that sense, he was an imperial Pan-Africanist. He dreamt of building a railway line, meandering through bush and desert, through hill and valley, all the way from the south to the Mediterranean, from Cape to Cairo. This strange Englishman even believed that what Africa needed was one government, the British, of course. Once you have occupied the black man's country, how do you get him to work for you? How do you get him to leave his little farm if he's not willing to do so? Well, in the old days, there was outright enslavement. But by the time of Cecil Rhodes, that was no longer permissible. There was also the Portuguese method across the border in Mozambique, plain forced labor. But that would cause controversy at Westminster, questions in Parliament. Cecil Rhodes and his companions had a better idea. Tax the native. Tax him on what? Well, it doesn't really matter. Tax him for having a home, the hut tax. Tax him for having a head, the head tax. But how would you get him to work for you through taxation? Simple. White man prints the money or mints the money, says to the black man, come and get it. The black man has to work to get it, then pays the white man back in taxation. Again, simple. But it bewildered the natives initially. You see, if a white man comes and takes over my country, if there's any payment to be made, I would have thought it would be from him to me as compensation or rent. But here was the white man charging me rent for building a hut in my own country. It took a while before it dawned upon us. We had not only lost our land, we were losing control of our labor.
In 1925, Firestone came to Liberia. Fearful of the monopoly Europe held with its domination of the Far Eastern plantations, they eagerly sought a new land that could grow rubber. Here was abundant rainfall. Here was a soil that for centuries had proved its ability to support tree crops. And here were a government and a people seeking a solution to self-improvement. There were no blueprints for these pioneering rubber growers as they established contact with the village people.
But is it true there were no blueprints? This Firestone film ignores the continuing blueprint of exploitation. Rubber is the classic cash crop, linking the era of the slave trade with the age of multinational corporations. Here's another example of Africa negotiating away its wealth. Working conditions on the largest rubber plantation in Africa have certainly improved since the days of King Leopold's Red Rubber Kingdom. But a Firestone tapper in this multi-million-dollar industry earns a basic $2.50 a day. Multinationals in Africa have a lot to answer for. Liberia was once regarded as Africa's Statue of Liberty. Freed slaves came here for sanctuary and opportunity, as if the Liberian Statue of Liberty also said, "Give me your tired, your poor, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." Yet those whom Abraham Lincoln emancipated, the rubber industry re-enslaved in modern ways. As with other raw materials and cash crops, Africa has no say in the price of rubber, no major impact on demand. What's more, there is no major rubber manufacturing industry in Liberia after more than half a century of its cultivation. The country exports the raw or semi-processed material and has to import tires and other industrial products when there are enough dollars in the bank.
63 pounds.
From the banquet of the rubber industry, only the leftovers fall to the local inhabitants. African feet may wear rubber tires, but African wheels do not. We can neither make our own tires nor find the money to buy enough from outside. Even in our deprivation, we can teach the industrial world a thing or two. What is waste in the West is raw material in Africa. The art of recycling is vigorous. Yesterday's drink cans become today's nightlights. As a child, I used just such a lamp to do my homework. Crude, homemade guns used by an anti-colonial movement in East Africa. At one level, it's a tribute, even in their crudity. The weapons are a tribute to the self-reliance, the simple technological self-reliance of African fighters under pressure. But at another level, the weapons are an indictment of the shallowness of the Western technological impact upon Africa. For 200 years, Africans have been buying guns from the West, going all the way back to the days of the slave trade. And yet, in 200 years, this is all we can do in terms of making weapons ourselves. It's certainly a measure of how shallow that industrial impact is. Africans may disagree about whether we should have greater military capability, but there's probably considerable consensus that we need more technological self-reliance than is represented by these instruments. Missionary education has had a special role to play in Africa, but clearly the gospel was not a manual of technology. Missionaries instructed us in the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it was the 4th R, religion, which was their priority. The effect of Western education, with its literary emphasis, was to discourage Africans from manual labor. We learnt to wear Western, dance Western, drill Western, speak Western. What we did not learn was to achieve Western in this temporal world. Piety rather than productivity was the main goal of Christian education. Many African Muslims felt threatened by Christian missionary education and turned inwards to their own religion and their own Quran schools. They saw colonial education generally as the standard bearer of an expanding Christianity. This distrust of the West prevented many African Muslims from developing technical skills. To save His Britannic Majesty's Muslim subjects from this technological backwardness, the Mombasa Institute of Muslim Education was created rather belatedly in colonial Kenya. Young Muslims came from all over East Africa. In the early 1950s, I was the boarding supervisor.
On arrival, the boarding house, the boarding supervisor shows students to their dormitories. Students gather beneath the shade of the mango tree, meeting old friends and making new ones. All instruction is in English.
At the time, there was a good deal of romantic idealism that the West was about to pay back to Islam its great debt of the past, the receipt of algebra, the receipt of the Arabic numerals, the receipt of the zero as a mathematical principle into the total Western civilization. Now, the West making Muslims once again technological.
Students of the Mombasa Institute of Muslim Education are Asian, African, and Arab, working and living happily together to prepare themselves for the future.
Ironically, it was a British colonial government which supported this exclusively Muslim experiment. but separate schools for different religions, paid for by public funds, were no longer acceptable when Kenya became independent. This college had to open its doors to Muslims and Christians alike. Special privileges for any denomination were at an end. As an institution designed to rescue African Muslims from technological backwardness, this particular polytechnic turned out to be too little, too late. In independent Africa, the backlog in education is depressing. Yet countries like Zimbabwe have shown what can be done. At independence, Zimbabwe had less than 200 secondary schools. Within 5 years, there were 6 times as many.
You should spread your grass, isn't it? Make sure it's spread enough so that we don't create a lot bigger. And bring more grass, please.
But the debate about what is taught is only just beginning.
If you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such sum or sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit.
The students here are preparing themselves for an examination on Shakespeare in a country which has just thrown off the British yoke.
I will seal to such a bond.
It takes time to decolonize a whole curriculum. Some say Shakespeare should be thrown out altogether. Others feel that even Shakespeare can be Africanized if taught in the light of our own experience. After all, The Merchant of Venice is partly about racial prejudice.
Why did Antonio spit on his Jewish gabardine? Why did he call him a misbeliever? A cutthroat dog? Why?
Africa's desperate need is for practical expertise.
And don't forget to align the work horizontally and diagonally.
Even basic vocational training strains the budgets of newly independent countries. Schools of this kind are rare.
The level is not touching the brick just because this brick here is high. So you're going to knock that brick.
Shortage of managerial and technical skills continues to leave Africa wide open to exploitation by outsiders. Liberia is Africa's leading producer of iron ore and one of the world's principal exporters. Africa as a whole produces some 15% of the world's iron ore. But Africa's crude steel manufacture is only 1% of the world's total, 15 to 1. That is the rough ratio between Africa's resources and its capacity to use them. This train is symbolic of the African condition. Most of it is made of iron and steel, so of course are the railway lines, along which its steel wheels are rolling. And yet, not a single mechanical part was made in Liberia. What the train is carrying is the raw material with which other trains will be made abroad. As the iron ore is exhausted, whole communities disintegrate and move on, leaving behind deserted neighborhoods. The foreigners come, they take, and they depart, often bequeathing decay rather than development. The second half of Lord Lugard's dual mandate, using Africa's resources for Africa's own development, remains unfulfilled.
We observe here today not just another breakthrough in the future of a developing Ghana, but equally important for a greater trust, the opportunity for broader understanding among nations.
It will also create new employment opportunities and impart technical industrial skills to a large number of Ghanaians.
Kwame Nkrumah had two major ambitions: the unification of Africa and the industrialization of Ghana. With the hydroelectric Akosombo project, he sought to realize both aspirations, give them a concrete expression: electricity for neighbors as well as for Ghana. Curiously enough, because of his own experiences in the United States as a student, both aspirations that Nkrumah had were themselves rooted in the American dream. He recognized the United States as a model both of continental unification and technological advancement. And so, as president now, he turned with a naive simplicity to the Americans to help him realize his dreams. But believe me, this is no monument to cooperation. It is a monument to exploitation. Behind the facade of technological advancement is the reality of economic failure. Ghana's industrialization may have been delayed by at least 2 generations as a result of this particular project. In return for US help, Ghana let the Kaiser Corporation build the biggest aluminum smelter outside North America. Smelting aluminum uses vast amounts of power, and the Americans got it at the cheapest rate. Ghanaians expected the aluminum to stimulate a whole range of industries, fulfilling Nkrumah's vision of an industrial revolution in Ghana. They also hoped that the smelter would use Ghana's own bauxite as raw material. Kaiser had other ideas. At this special port for aluminium, semi-processed bauxite arrives all the way from Jamaica to be used in this particular factory. Barely 100 miles away, there are resources of Ghanaian bauxite. Why aren't they used? It would certainly have been more compatible with Nkrumah's dream of using local resources and undertaking local industrializing processes. Well, why not? It would seem the real reasons are to be sought in the mere fact that out there in Jamaica, Kaiser, the parent company, already has resources of bauxite. And what is more, Kaiser also has the ships to transport it all the way from the shores of the Caribbean into Ghana. When the dam was built, Western experts overcalculated by about 20% the likely volume of water available. Because of that, there is a shortfall in electricity generated. The large-scale fishing and tourist industry never materialized. Ambitious plans for irrigation downstream were curtailed. The drought has compounded the problem, playing cat and mouse with the whole project. Sometimes only 2 out of the 6 turbines are working. The fate of the dam affects the destiny of the factory. At times, the smelter has had to be closed down completely. Hundreds of workers are laid off, to be invited back only when the gods of Akasombo once again smile on this sad and uncertain technological monument. Zaire has another such tale to tell, a dead steel mill. In a bid to correct a century of colonial neglect, rulers of independent Africa have tried a shortcut to a new industrial revolution. They have mortgaged their souls for capital-intensive projects, exposing themselves to Western sharks in search of a pound of flesh. The debts accumulate. While our ancient kings built palaces and pyramids, our modern presidents erect steel mills, hydroelectric dams, temples to the gods of modern technology. Why do I call them temples? Because they are based on faith rather than rational calculation. You know, we don't have to adopt Western solutions for African problems. But when we do adopt such solutions, like heavy industry, we should also adopt the logic that comes with that type of thing, the logic of rational calculation, of maximizing benefits, of minimizing costs. There are no 2 ways about it. To paraphrase a Western poet, Alexander Pope, a little modernity is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Western spring. We build empty factories at home and import products from other people's factories abroad. This legacy is not of development, but of dependency. We produce in our mines what we do not use. We use in our barracks what we do not produce. Every bit of this military hardware on parade in Zaire has been imported from abroad. The old gun trade of the slave days has found new proportions. Yes, the West did arrive in Africa with a bang. Our soil is still recoiling with a whimper.
WETA is responsible for the series The Africans on American Public Television. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the funders.